And we're going to kind of revisit some of these things today. So we talked about kind of the Red Sea trap, where it was not a good place to be, except that's where God wanted them to be. And then, being led by the pillar of fire on one side and the cloud on the other, and how God used that. And we're going to get to it, how that should have been another red flag to Pharaoh, like, whoa. We talked about firstborns and how the firstborns were spared. Therefore, God says the firstborns belong unto the Lord. And we looked at some stats of firstborns and how most of the U.S. presidents were firstborns. Most CEOs are firstborns. There is a difference in birth order. Remember, years ago there were a number of books written about that, by Dobson and other guys, how birth order affected. And even if you lose a child, there's kind of that gap where the firstborn, if they lose your firstborn, the next one doesn't necessarily take on those characteristics, which I think is interesting. So those, and then, fourthborns are very different. Secondborns, they talk about how, especially if they're the same gender, same sex as the older one, that they seem to have more trouble, competing with that brother and for attention of the parents, and can lead to, some issues. I remember at the Gothard seminars, he'd have people raise their hand, how many of you are firstborns? And it seemed like just about everybody would raise their hand. But once again and over again, Moses reminds the people from God, don't forget this. Teach it to your children. It goes on throughout, the travels through the wilderness. Or when they cross the Jordan, they put the rocks in the middle and they say, don't forget. Keep telling, it was all, and of course it was all oral tradition back then. People didn't have their own little, Bibles, or they didn't keep a diary necessarily. Even in Jesus' time, probably, 50% of the people were pretty much illiterate, at least functionally illiterate. And so they relied on oral reminders and the reading of the scrolls, which very few people had. So remember in Exodus 9, which reminds us that from the kind of the beginning, God told, Pharaoh was told, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. Otherwise, I am going to send all my plagues against you, your officials and your people. Then you will know that there is no one like me in all the earth. That's God's purpose in everything. As surely as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of God. And because we talked about how, God could have just said, okay, day number 1, Egyptians, you're done. Israelites, leave. But God didn't do it that way. And it was somewhat of an increasing difficulty for the Egyptians until finally it affected the lives of people. It actually touched, human bodies. Before it was kind of nature, and then, the boils, and then, of course, the death of the firstborn, which was the ultimate. And now, Pharaoh's thinking, well, there were 10 plagues, but he hasn't really got me yet, and I'm a god, so I'm gonna do it. And of course, God hardened his heart, which we'll talk about more too. Remember Genesis 15, to tie, Genesis and Abraham to all of this, God was very specific. He told Abraham, guess what? Your people are going to come back and inhabit this land. It's going to be 400 years though. And they're going to be captive by another country, but they are going to get back here. And I'm sure that promise through oral tradition was passed on to people. People said, well, remember what God told Abraham. Remember Joseph too he says, when you leave, you take my bones with you and bury me with my forefathers, with Abraham in the tomb. So I'm sure they held on to that. It was pretty hard though, I'm sure. In this redemption of the firstborn was to be perpetual. The Passover celebration was to be perpetual. And then as a New Testament application, 1 Peter 1:18, where it says, you have been redeemed, not with silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. So then we watched the Ray Vander Laan part of this next one, Israel leaving Egypt, and his insights there, which, all the gods, like he pointed out earlier too, all the gods that were mocked in all of these plagues. Not necessarily a specific god, some people would say, but it seems like at least some of them were. The Nile and the fly god and the frog god and Ra, the sun god, when it turned dark. So it seems like there were some, and I don't know if the Egyptians really got it or not. Pharaoh didn't. Pharaoh didn't say, oh. The magicians did somewhat, after the third plague. They said, you know what? We can't do it. It's got to be the finger of the Hebrew God. That's the only explanation we have.
Pharaoh was not with the army, was he? Going into the Red Sea. Pharaoh himself was not.
He didn't go into the Red Sea, but the movie, The Ten Commandments, shows him watching, so.
Well, it doesn't say that it says Pharaoh's army, but it doesn't say, I was wondering.
I think Pharaoh, at least Pharaoh saw it.
Yeah.
And he ordered them to go in.
Right, that's what it's easy to tell somebody else to do.
Right. Yeah. But, that was on purpose by God too, so he could see all of this.
Yeah.
And then go back to Egypt with his tail between his legs, saying, well, you know what? The news was probably not real nice to him.
Yeah.
All the pundits were giving. So we're in chapter 14. We're going to start there today again. So chapter 14, 1 through 2, where they kind of give a description of where they are. So somebody read 14, 1 through 2.
Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth,
Right.
between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon.
Okay. So we don't know exactly where that is. You can't even pronounce the names, right? So, but Ray Vander Laan last week was saying too, nobody knows exactly where that crossing point was. But we know that they did come to the Red Sea. It was kind of a cul-de-sac. The only way out was across the Red Sea. If they went back, they were going to run into Pharaoh and his army. So verse 3, somebody read that one.
Pharaoh will think, the Israelites are wandering around the land and in confusion, hemmed in by the desert.
Okay. So how did he know that? Well, he probably had spies sent out. Okay, you follow them and tell me and report back what they're doing. And so he saw them, that they were in the wilderness. It seemed to him that they were in confusion, kind of lost puppies out in the woods. But God had led them there So he thought this was going to be easy pickings. Here we have a bunch of slaves, not armed. We can get them. And we can get revenge. He thought they were trapped, but with God they were not. So, verse 4 talks about that God hardened his heart again. And that God was going to be honored, and the Egyptians back in Egypt will know that he is the Lord, no other. Now, the chariot drivers, they probably realized that at the last minute. But the Egyptians, when they got word back in Egypt, they were probably thinking, why did Pharaoh do this? You know, what a bad decision. It's got to be, the God of the Hebrews must be real. You would have think, like I said, all the 10 plagues would have been enough. You would have thought, okay, this has been pretty bad. Let's not push the envelope and ask for more. But they did. Once again, so that God would be honored. It's hard to understand, but so verses 5 through 7, it says the heart of Pharaoh and his servant's heart were turned against the people. So even his officials were on board apparently at this. You know, earlier we kind of thought that some of them were telling him, you know, this is a bad idea, you know, just let him go. But God hardened more than just Pharaoh's heart in this. And he still had 600 chariots and his army available, even after all the plagues.
That was even beyond that. Other officials were in their chariots as well.
Right, and then
There was a
plus
real
the
gene pool kind of going on
yeah.
there.
Plus, it seems like there was the foot soldiers too, the army. Yeah,
Yeah,
and so the chariots would go first and kind of clear things out, and then that foot army would come through and clean up the mess.
it indicates there that Pharaoh was in that group.
Yeah, verse 6, so he made his chariot ready
Mhm.
and took his people with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Google says
So
he
he was
did.
there.
That he what?
He drowned with it.
That Pharaoh says he drowned?
The drowning of Pharaoh's army he wasn't included in that.
Oh,
But, Genesis 18, I think.
Oh, Genesis what?
No, it's Exodus 14, I think.
18?
Yeah.
it seems like that's
So what are they basing that on?
yeah.
If it's not out of the Bible, I'm not sure we're gonna be necessarily believing that.
Historically, I don't know, of course, we don't know, we don't have much written by the Egyptians about this event, for good reason.
There's one person that he's talking about, 18, says, and Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. Doesn't say,
Doesn't say that he died, right?
not in that part, you know.
What is it? It's talking about the chase through the Red Sea there as Pharaoh drew near. I don't think anybody survived that. They wouldn't have been able to get out of the way when the water caved in on them.
No, it says all of the army died, the
Yeah.
chariots were
Which
drowned.
included Pharaoh, right?
Well,
If he-
I guess that's,
Because he was right there leading them.
I thought it.
Oh.
I don't see it.
In verse 28, it depends on how you're reading it. This is the waters flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed. So was it the entire army followed or the entire army that followed? You know what I'm saying? Did
Yeah.
part of them not go, but the entire army that did drown?
yep. Well,
You know,
no, it was
I
a-
might be picking it apart too much, but
yeah, yeah. I'm gonna hold to the Ten Commandments movie, it shows Pharaoh.
it has to be our day by day.
Right. Cecil B. DeMille's, I mean, he's almost scripture, right?
It's really tough to tread water with all that iron hanging out.
Right,
there.
yeah.
Only guess.
Well, you know, when they did come, I'm sure they were thinking, you can imagine the slaughter that could have taken place. You know, older men, young children, women, you know, 2.5 million people. It would have been, you know, for these trained warriors to come through, it would have been, you know, a massacre. You know, and they, like I mentioned, they probably wanted revenge for their lost sons, livestock, the economy. They had revenge in their eyes. And I was thinking, much like when the Russians at the end of World War II were invading Berlin, you know, they wanted revenge for all that had happened when the Germans had invaded Russia and had slaughtered millions of people there. And that's why, you know, all the Germans were thinking, hey, let's run the other way to the Americans, you know, because we know what the Russians will do if they get here. Okay, then verses 8 through 10. Somebody read verse 10 there.
As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord.
Okay. So,
So Pharaoh's with them.
yeah, oh yeah, Pharaoh's with them. Now, God wanted them where he put them to make only God could save them. I mean, this was an impossible situation. You're helpless, you don't have an army, you haven't been trained, you've been slaves, and now here comes the most mighty army in the world coming, ready to slaughter. And they were sore afraid for good reason. You know, they were literally between the rock and a hard place. And as Anne of Green Gables would say, in the depths of despair.
And they didn't have any transformers that would go from a chariot into a boat.
No. Yeah, they weren't going to build any boats. There wasn't going to be any ferry that would be there to take them across. Oh, verse 11, somebody read that one.
And then they said to Moses, is it because there was no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt?
Yeah. Well, then you think of, okay, what would I have done in that situation? I'm thinking, yeah, but now look what's happening. And so they're showing their immaturity still and their slave mentality. You know, and there were plenty of grave sites and mummies in Egypt. You know, there was plenty of places to get buried there. So their statement is kind of ironic. You know, wasn't there enough, you know, grave sites in Egypt that you had to kill us here? So, verse 12. Somebody read that one.
Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? Or it would have been better if we to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.
Yeah. So, once again, didn't we say just leave us alone? I mean, they were crying out, remember. That's what God said. You know, I've heard the pain of my people crying out. And so, I mean, that's really just a false statement. When, you know, they were all on board when Moses first kind of said, okay, I'm going to be the deliverer, and here's the signs of it. So it's kind of like how soon we forget. And that's true of all of us, isn't it? You know, God has helped us and delivered us in the past, but then when we face a new situation, we say, well, I guess God doesn't care. Well, you know, at least it made me think of people who accept Christ, suffer persecution, and then they might be tempted to say, hey, I had it good when I wasn't a believer. You know, you think of people in, you know, Muslim countries or back in the Iron Curtain days, you know, when they became a believer and then they're arrested and they're put into prison. I mean, I think it would be easy to say, maybe I shouldn't have. Would have been, look what happened to my family. So they were helpless and hopeless, and we are hopeless and helpless without Christ too. And God brought them to that point where the only way out was up. Now, verse 13, I'm really proud of Moses here, because Moses steps up, and he doesn't join the crowd like he did at the beginning of the plagues. Remember, when the plagues first started, and the people got more persecuted, they said you got to make bricks without straw, you got to gather your own straw. What did the people do? They went to Moses and they said, hey, you know what? What are you doing? It's supposed to get all better. It's not worse. And remember what Moses did at that point. He went to God and complained too. He said, hey God, they got a point. And you know what? I was really content being in Midian taking care of my sheep. I didn't really want to come. And God did have to drag him. Screaming and hollering all the way with his heels in, there were skid marks all the way across.
We're not like that, are we?
And well, yeah.
I hope not.
And then verse 14, though, he stands up and he says, the Lord will fight for you.
The last sentence in verse 13, the Egyptians whom you see today, shall never see again. Would that include Pharaoh?
Well, they probably never saw him again.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
It haunts back, haunting back to the end of chapter 10, when the Lord had hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh said, get away from me, beware, do not see my face again. Moses said, you're right, I shall never see your face again.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like, never going to see your face again.
Yeah. Yeah, have fun back in Egypt.
Yeah.
Have fun in your pyramid in the afterlife. Well, so then verse 15 and 16 he's saying, here's the instructions. And he takes the shepherd's staff again, which has been his tool all along, which is interesting that God let him keep from his former occupation and let him use that. So stand still and have faith to go forward through the water tunnel. Now, would you have been a little bit hesitant? Here you have, it must have been awesome, You have water on both sides. It might have even gone all the way over the top, we don't know. But it was a tunnel through, and it was dry ground, which is another, like J. Vernon McGee talks about, he says, even evangelical professors or whatever, they will try to minimize this and try to make a natural explanation for this whole deal. And there is no natural explanation. They can say, well, there was an earthquake and there was a rift, and that doesn't, or even the wind blowing would not have done that to put water up on both sides, a natural wind. So he's kind of disappointed in people, because, if God made the world, he could certainly do this. So there's no, like I said, no explanation. We just have to accept it as a miracle. Someone said it was a tsunami or something that came. And then, of course, we talked last week, the joke about they went across on the Reed Sea, and the little boy saying, boy, that was really a miracle. And the teacher said, why? He says, because all of Pharaoh's army drowned in 6 inches of water. So, and once again, it's hard to imagine Pharaoh seeing this happen and then say, we're going to go forward anyways. It seems like it would make sense and logical sense to say at that point, you know what, let's go back.
Well, I think he thought the ocean opened for him.
Well, he could
It was
have,
his,
yeah,
his God that opened it.
yeah. He's given us a chance to kill him in the water.
Yeah.
So his heart was hardened even more to follow. Well, McGee points out, they probably didn't even realize their hearts were hardened. If you had interviewed them at that point, say, do you think God hardened your heart? Oh no, we want to do this.
It reminds me of the tribulation time when everything is happening, the bowls are being emptied, the scrolls being opened, and all the wrath of God is being poured out, and people are cursing God.
Yeah, yeah, good.
So,
Yeah, so, and so when people have a hard heart and when their mind is darkened and deceived, when you're deceived, you don't know you're deceived. And all of the logic in the world isn't going to change that. So verse 18 through 21. Now, who does it say is actually doing this here?
He's an angel of God.
Yeah.
Mm,
And it's not just an angel, it's the angel of the Lord,
Yeah, angel.
which is really, usually it's the pre-incarnate Christ.
Jesus.
It's Jesus, yeah. So here's Christ in the middle of it, protecting them. And the Egyptians could not go after them because of the cloud. And once again, you would think, this is kind of special. This isn't a natural phenomena. I think we should go back home. There might have been some in the, the chariot guys saying, you know what, I got a family back home. But they were trained to do or die. They were going to obey. They were good soldiers, I guess. So a natural wind, like we said, could not have accomplished this. Okay, let's look at verse 22 through 25.
It's interesting to note
Yeah.
too that there was that cloud, there was a cloud between the Egyptians and Israel
Mm-hmm.
too. But it says there was a cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was, and I think, there was it seems like there was the fire, the Shekinah glory on one side, and the cloud on the other blocking them.
Right.
And so they had light, the Israelites had light. Now that should have given hope to the Israelites too. They were saying, oh, okay,
It says the other one didn't come near the other all night long.
yeah, yeah. Well, they couldn't,
No?
yeah,
It's the ultimate nightlight.
yeah. Yeah, the Shekinah glory would be the ultimate nightlight.
So did all this take place during the night? So they weren't
Well, at least
camped,
part of it.
they weren't camped out and resting up for the journey through the Red Sea?
Yeah, I'm thinking there had to be a period of time, because there were approximately 2 million
Yeah.
Israelites, and you're not gonna cross the sea in 5 minutes.
No, no.
So it had to be
Maybe-
blockage for a while.
Yeah.
So some maybe got across during daylight, and some it was nighttime when they went through.
Possibly, yeah.
No, there was one thing I kind of forgot to mention why they went that way too. The logical way they should have gone was up along the coast and up through the land of the Philistines. But God said, I'm not going to let you do that because you're not ready to fight. And that would have been the short route too. Some people have said, you could get to the promised land maybe in 40 days, but it took 40 years.
The compass is broken.
Yeah. So, verse 22 through 25. Somebody want to get that?
And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of the chariots come off, so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt.
Yeah, so they finally got it. You know, when your wheels fall off, that's usually a problem.
And that would have slowed them down too, obviously.
Right,
Give the
yeah.
Israelites more time.
So they had a head start, like you say, for 2.5 million people to get going. And I'm sure there were some slow pokes, you know,
Yeah.
come on, Grandpa Joe, come on.
And all their supplies and everything.
Yeah.
that-
But they were all walking, and these chariots, they had the horses running.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's why God had the wheels fall off.
That's right.
I've had the wheels fall off a time or two.
Well, figuratively, right?
Figuratively, yeah.
Okay,
Well, it
so,
sounds like that it was a night journey.
right, because the
It says it-
last night, watch of the night.
Yeah, because it was returned to its normal state at daybreak. So,
But the Shekinah glory was giving them light
yeah. So
while they were crossing, and we don't know how far they got all the way, if they were halfway through when they started, or if they were all the way across. So we're gonna see a lot of things about, Ken mentioned this too, that there's some archaeological so we'll watch this guy here.
You should go on
The
down.
ground as they crossed the Red Sea. Well, Pharaoh's army did not have so much luck. They ended up drowning in the Red Sea as a way for God to protect God's people and also to punish.
Our archaeologists have said, oh yeah, you know, that must be, because secular archaeologists wouldn't even say that the Exodus was that real, you know, that it was just kind of a myth. So, verses 26 through 28, you know, this whole thing is impossible to explain without a miracle. Now, verse 30 through 31, can you imagine seeing this and getting across, and then seeing the water come back down on the Egyptians, and then a little bit later on seeing Egyptian bodies washed up on the shore? I mean, that's got to be a faith builder. Now, it didn't last real long, if you'll remember, as we'll get to it, because as soon as they run out of water, well, wait a minute, you know, wasn't there enough water and fruits and melons in Egypt? But we'll get to that later. So then they sing, you know, the Song of Moses. And Miriam takes the women out into the field with tambourines. And they start singing, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider has he thrown into the sea. And that was an old praise song from Scripture and Song back in the 1970s, if some of you remember that. Really. And then, you know, I think the Song of Moses, it talks about that people sing that in the book of Revelation too. So it's going to be a big hit.
Top 10.
Top 10. Okay, so any comments or questions? So next we'll start with their kind of adventure after next week. Next week we'll start doing that. So next week we'll have a lesson. Then I was thinking the 21st we'll probably not have a lesson, since that's kind of Christmas week and people will be busy doing that kind of shopping and things like that. So
I have a
maybe family
question
coming. Yeah.
about, okay, when they're gonna cross the Red Sea, they're heading east, aren't they?
Right.
And the wind is coming from the east.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how that works. I had always pictured the wind coming from behind their back, and that the sea would open up as they step forward. But no, it's,
I think it was all done first, and then they went. That's what I thought.
oh, so you think it was all open, and then they
Yeah.
said, okay, go
Right.
ahead.
Yeah.
The only time a river didn't open until the priests set their feet in it was when Joshua was leading them
Yeah,
into
and
the promised
that was a
land.
different.
That was a whole different thing, but yeah, no, this was already open. God had already had it open. Yeah.
Okay,
That's what I think anyway.
okay. And so in looking at this map, there's kind of this Y-shaped thing,
That's
So
one
they're going-
speculation of where they worked.
but they're going through that fork that's over on the left side. Is that where they're crossing, somewhere along in there?
Well, like I said, they don't know for sure.
Well, I
And
know.
one thing we need to take into consideration, the shape of the land is different now than it was then.
Oh,
There's
well,
been
that could be.
multiple earthquakes, multiple changes in water levels,
Yep.
and so it's, we can't judge it based on what
Part
we
of the Rift
see.
Valley
okay.
there.
Yeah.
Because it kind of looks like a river.
But you
Not
can
my
see,
picture.
that it would have been probably easier to just go up along the coast here
Uh-huh.
and just go into the land of the Philistines, which was part of the promised land, and say, here we are,
But that doesn't look
Eas-
closer to me. It looks
Well,
closer to go
it'd be
through the Red
easier,
Sea.
because they wandered around, of course, in Midian in the wilderness, and they had to go to Mount Sinai.
And they didn't have much for boats. So it would
This
have
is real
been,
north,
yeah.
taking the easy way.
Right. So, it might have been an easier, might have been some roads there, trade routes.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the Philistines were not nice people, as we know from Bible history. Very warlike. So we're going to watch what we can in 15 minutes. Now this is something that is by penalty of law if we show it on YouTube. So now somebody has said it was easy getting the people out of Egypt, but it was harder getting Egypt out of the people.
Yeah.
Well,
This is hard to do.
just as hard today. Like you mentioned, we had. It was very, very moving there, and then how that song came out. Somebody didn't get it copyrighted or anything, they just sang it. So,
In case anybody was wondering if this really happening, they left dead bodies strewn on the shore of the
Right.
sea.
yeah, it was an extra exclamation mark.
Yeah, a little exclamation point there.
Yeah, right. And you just wonder back, if Pharaoh was alive, and you just wonder back there, what's Pharaoh thinking now? What's his wife tell him when he gets home?
Yeah. Probably days here.
Yeah. What did you do now? So you're a god, huh? Okay. Well, thank you for coming, and we'll meet again next week and get into chapter 15 and kind of their journey into Midian, where God continues to get Egypt out of them. Okay, well, thanks for coming.